Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from Madison Realty Capital, New York Community Bank, M&T Bank, AmTrust Title, Customers Bank, Ariel Property Advisors, Capital One Bank, Sterling National Bank, Marks Paneth LLP, Meridian Capital Group. Additional funding has been provided by grants from Amarant Bank, AVR Realty Company, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Briarwood Organization, B6 Real Estate Advisors, CBRE, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Chase Mortgage Lending, Citizens Bank, Collins Building Services, CPEX Real Estate Services, Douglaston Development Levine Builders, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Handro Properties Handler Real Estate Organization, Hodges Ward Elliott INC, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, John Casamatidis Red Apple Group, Kilroy Architectural Windows, Matone Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Optimum Window Manufacturing Corp., People's United Bank, Rockefeller Group, Rosewood Realty Group, RPW Group, SJP Properties, Stonehenge NYC, TD Bank, Terra CRG, the Merringor Family Foundation, and these friends. The Bronx, Roosevelt Island, Bronx Science, Grinnell College, Hunter College, New York City for supportive housing, Breaking Ground. I have the president and CEO of Breaking Ground, Brenda Rosen. Thank you for being here.
Nice to be here.
Let's start with your father's side, how they arrived in America, and then your mother, which has a longer history over there. Tell me about Dad's side.
Yeah, my grandparents on my dad's side came over here when they were fairly young. My grandmother came over when she was a baby.
Where did she come from?
Poland. And my grandfather came over from Russia when he was a bit older, and he was in his teens. And they moved to the Bronx.
How they meet? Any idea?
I don't know how they met.
So they moved to the Bronx, and what did Grandpa do?
He had a hardware store up in the Bronx, but then lost it in the Depression and spent most of his life working in a hardware store on 9th Avenue in Hell's Kitchen.
Okay. Now let's talk about the English-Scottish people, the other side, Mom's side.
Yeah.
Tell me about them.
Yeah, so they're a bigger family. Everybody either grew up in London or in Glasgow, and my grandmother and my granddad met when they were in their early 20s in London, and they married, and he went off to World War II in the Navy, and one of my uncles had been born, so they stayed with my mom during the Blitz in London. So they spent a lot of their time in underground shelters, bomb shelters, and then after the war, my grandfather came back and had another child. So I had two uncles. During the war, actually, for almost a year, my mom was sent away and separated from her mom, sent to Wales because it was just too dangerous in London. She said that she used to, after they'd spend the night in the bomb shelters, they'd come up in the morning to see what buildings were still left, and they were always hoping that their public school was gone. But that building always seemed to survive.
So when did your mother's parents come over?
My mother's parents always stayed. They stayed in London.
So when did your mother come over?
My mother came over after my grandfather said that she was a woman and didn't need to go to college. And my mother came over to Virginia because we had some third cousins or something like that nobody really knew, but she got permission to come over to visit them. So she came over to visit them. She was here for months, and then decided she wanted to go back home to London. It was time, but she didn't have enough money for a plane ticket. So she got on a bus, came to Port Authority, and then ended up renting a room in a hotel at the Times Square Hotel on a week-by-week basis while she worked in a bakery to earn enough money to go home.
Tell me about Dad.
My dad grew up in the Bronx. Again, his dad was off working like 7 days a week at this hardware store. He went to school in the Bronx. He went to high school, DeWitt Clinton in the Bronx. And then he was a Marine in the Korean War. And while he was in Korea, his dad had a heart attack and passed away. He came back and kind of was trying to deal with that and looking for jobs, and he became a security guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
And how does he meet Mom?
Well, she had no friends except for the person that sold newspapers in the lobby of the Times Square. And so before going off to the bakery every morning, she'd say hi and she'd chat with him. And my dad was also friends with the person who owned the newsstand in the Times Square and would come by once in a while to say hi. And the person that sold newspapers decided that my mom needed a friend besides him and introduced my mom and dad in the lobby of the Times Square Hotel. And
So when does Mom and Dad get married?
got married about 6 months later. It was pretty quick, 1961.
So it's 1961, and you have an older brother, if I remember.
Yeah, 2 years older.
Okay. And then Brenda is born. You were born in the Bronx.
Yes.
So tell me about the early days before Roosevelt Island, which has a great story in your life.
Grew up, started my life living in the same apartment that my dad had grown up in Norwood, the Norwood section of the Bronx, which when he grew up there, it had been kind of an Orthodox Jewish community. By the time I was a child growing up there, it was very Irish Catholic, so much so that I went to church with my friends, and I specialized in Irish dancing, so I can do the jig and the reel quite well to this day. And
Then you said the neighborhood was changing.
the neighborhood was changing. The building that we were living in was not the safest. My
Was it a
parents.
5-story walk-up?
It was a 5-story walk-up. We lived on the 4th floor, and I distinctly remember you had to be very careful about what you plugged in. You couldn't plug in the toaster and the TV at the same time. You blow a fuse and have to go down to the basement of the building.
And God forbid you to have a fire.
Yeah.
How do your parents end up at Roosevelt Island?
They read about Roosevelt Island. It was brand new. I think it had opened in '76 and was advertising kind of low-income housing and looking for people to go. It was an experiment at the time, and we were fortunate enough to get an apartment that was affordable for us, and so we relocated.
So one day, the 10-year-old with her 11-year-old brother, right?
Mm-hmm.
What happens?
Well, we were actually, it was about 9 days after we moved into our apartment on the island. It was in the summer, so we were at this community pool on the island, and we came home and all we saw were fire engines everywhere. And after hunting around for a little while, found out that we couldn't go into our apartment because it was our apartment and a few others.
Which had a fire.
And
destroyed all of your family's possessions.
Everything.
And what happens? Because it's very interesting because of your own career for supporting people.
Yeah, what happened was my parents were at work. I was with my brother.
Your dad was at the museum at this time?
Mm-hmm.
And Mom was doing what?
My mom was a records keeper at JCPenney, I think it was. and we couldn't find a way to call my parents. The management office wouldn't let us use their phone, so a neighbor took us in and let us call them and say, I think you should come home because we've had a fire. I don't think they really necessarily believed us. We were only, 10 and 11. And they came home and everything was gone. And when we asked for help, we were told that we had to go into the shelter system, that they had nothing for us.
So there wasn't a shelter on Roosevelt Island.
No,
So at this
we
time,
knew nothing.
So this couple over here with their 10 and 11-year-old are told that they have to go into the shelter system in New York City, which really wasn't a great system at that time.
Right.
And what happens? The neighbors went out of their way, right?
Yeah, the neighbors that we didn't even know yet really rallied behind us, and the next thing you knew, they kind of came up to us and they said that the community had gotten together and gone to management and said, you can't let this family just be homeless and go into the shelter system. They have nothing. And because Roosevelt Island was so new, there were so many vacant apartments, they coerced the management into giving us a vacant apartment that we moved into, and we slept on the floor for a few months while my parents' jobs took up collections and all sorts of things happened to get us back on our feet.
So now you're in Roosevelt Island, where you went to public school, and then what happens is you graduate, you're finishing junior high school at this time, and then you were trying to go to one of the schools in the city, like Stuyvesant, Hunter, Bronx Science, and what happens?
Well,
were you a science student?
I was a science student. Yep, I was accepted into Bronx Science, so I got up at 5:30 in the morning every morning, took the tram over from the island to Manhattan, and then took the train up to the Bronx, and it was a great experience. I was really lucky.
Talk to me about jobs during high school. What were you doing?
I started babysitting when I was 10 years old. I don't understand why anybody let me take care of their 2-year-old when I was 10, but I did. I had quite a business, and then I had an after-school job at an investment firm. So in between sports and school, I would work about 3 days a week after school, filing.
Well, what about law? Because you also went to Cardozo.
Yeah, well, while I was in high school, a lot of things started to dawn on me, including how things had not gone. At the end of the day, things went well for us on Roosevelt Island. We ended up having a great life there, but we weren't treated all that well when the fire happened. And I'm to this day incredibly appreciative of the help we got, but I realized that without that help, our entire lives could have been incredibly different. And so I went through a period where I was angry, and I had decided that in one way or another I was going to go into public service. I don't think I knew for sure, although I was already thinking about law school when I was in high school, maybe because I like to argue with people, I'm not sure.
So how did you decide to go to Grinnell College?
The only way that you could legitimately get out of a high school class when you were a senior at Bronx Science was when the college recruiters came and allowed you to skip class to go down and see a presentation. I was in physics and hated physics, and took a look and saw that this school from Iowa was coming and presenting, which I never ever considered, but it seemed more appealing than physics. So I went down and I listened to the person talk about the school and walked out and thought, that sounds kind of interesting and entirely different than what I'm used to. And so,
especially in Iowa.
Yes, in the middle of nowhere in Iowa.
You went there for 2 years.
2 years.
Financially it was difficult.
Yeah.
You come back. How'd you decide on going to Hunter?
It was pretty late. It was, late in the summer before my junior year of college, and I was lucky enough to be able to go into Hunter and meet with one of the deans, tell my story about where I was. She was really familiar with Grinnell. I had already missed the regular application deadline for Hunter, but she allowed me to register anyway, and I started there almost immediately.
Scholar program, tell me about that, which has also change on your life.
Yeah, Hunter was amazing and offered these incredible programs, one of which still exists. And I got involved with something called the Public Service Scholar Program, which was for kids that had a certain GPA, but were also interested in politics and urban affairs. And so I was accepted into that program, and at the time, you had to take a certain number of classes and also do an externship for 20 hours a week for some sort of stipend. And Ruth Messenger was the councilwoman of the Upper West Side, and I was able to take a class with her on city politics and also intern with her for the year. And at the time, Gail Brewer was her chief of staff. And so I was able to get involved in all sorts of different things that they were working on. And once I did that, I knew that something in government was calling my name. I just wasn't sure what.
So what happens next?
After I graduated Hunter, I took 2 years off to save money to go to law school.
And what were you doing?
I worked for Roger Ailes.
I thought so. But
Yeah,
this is when Roger was in the publicity business.
He was doing Giuliani's campaign for mayor, doing a lot of national campaigns, George W. Bush. So we disagreed about almost everything, except it was a tremendous opportunity to learn a lot, and so I don't regret it. And I was able to save money to then go to law school.
So you decided on Benjamin Cardozo Law School, part of Yeshiva University.
Yep.
And over there, tell me about the summers. What did you do during the summers?
1 year I worked at the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Civil Division. Another year I worked for the City Council, the Council of General Welfare.
Which was more up to what you were finishing.
Yes.
So you graduate Cardozo, you're a lawyer, you're an activist. What happens now?
I start looking for a job, and I found a job with the Department of Homeless Services. And the Homeless Services at the time was young. It had originally been part of HRA. It had become a bigger agency, and the need was becoming bigger. And so it was allowed to be its own agency with a sunset clause. And so I joined the city agency when it was young, and small, and a bit chaotic, and that allowed me to do a lot of different things. So I had an incredible opportunity at DHS. I thought I was just going to be a staff attorney, kind of doing your regular legal briefs. We were getting sued by Legal Aid Society all the time. So it was a very busy time, and I was both a lawyer, but I was also asked to go up to the South Bronx and re-engineer and run the intake center for all families that were claiming homelessness. There's a central intake center. There still is. It's been renamed and been rebuilt. It's much more beautiful now. But if you said you needed shelter, you had to come through that building, that intake center, and I was asked to go run it.
So after the intake center, how does this nonprofit organization, Common Ground, find this individual? How did you end up there?
Common Ground was in construction, rehabilitating its second building, and the founder at the time was looking for a director of the second building and had relationships with the Department of Homeless Services, happened to call over and say, do you have any great people that you'd recommend I try to steal from you? And my name came up, and I went over to meet with her and thought, this looks interesting. I've done operations before. I've been on the side of defending the city, and now I have an opportunity to work kind of on the other side where people that are homeless are coming into housing for services, and thought I'd give it a shot for a few years. And that
What year is this?
1999.
So it's 1999. You go to this nonprofit, which was small at that time, and one of the first projects that they did was the Times Square Hotel.
The Times Square.
Right. So tell me about the Times Square Hotel, and then the Prince George Hotel.
So the Times Square Hotel was the first building that Common Ground rehabilitated on the corner of 43rd and 8th, and happened to be the same place that my parents met. And then.
So what do you mean by rehabilitated?
Well, if you know Times Square in the 80s and the 90s, it wasn't the place you really wanted to hang out. And the hotel was very run down. It had, in its glory, been really beautiful. It was very run down and really rampant with drug users and people that sold drugs, and rented out on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis. But it was not adding value to the community. And so Common Ground saw an opportunity to purchase the building and use low-income housing tax credits to turn it into what still stands today as the largest supportive housing building in the United States. So permanent housing with 650 apartments, 60% of which, so over 300, that were rented to people that were homeless coming out of shelter at the time, and the balance of the building going to low-income people.
What about the other?
The Prince George. So the Prince George was the second building that then Common Ground saw as an opportunity to rehabilitate. It had been a welfare hotel. It had been used for similar purposes. Families had been put into studio apartments, and the city had shut down the hotel. We purchased it and again used low-income housing tax credits and historic tax credits to renovate the building and turn it into 416 apartments for formerly homeless people and for low-income people.
You have a son and a daughter. Tell me about them a little bit.
My daughter just turned 18. My son just turned 16.
Their names?
Maddie and Dylan.
Right, and then she's going to be going to college?
Yes, in about 7 months. She's very excited. We're all very excited.
Right, and Dylan?
He's a junior in high school. He goes to the Garden School. It's a small school in Jackson Heights, Queens. He's just starting to think about college.
So you come back to Breaking Ground.
I came back and I started as the head of all of housing operations.
Right. Explain for my audience, what is supportive housing?
Supportive housing is affordable housing, rent-stabilized housing, like any other affordable housing in the city. The difference is that we have an abundance of services that are on site inside the building to help people become and remain stable. And so that can include psychiatric services, primary medical care, case management services, entitlement services to make sure that you're receiving the benefits that you're entitled to, all sorts of workshops that help people become and stay self-sufficient. So we have a community-supported agriculture program at the Prince George that's been around for 19 years now, where tenants and people in the community buy shares into this farm from upstate New York. Vegetables and fruit are brought down in the summer, and people come and collect their vegetables, and we give cooking classes to help residents understand how to live, cook on a budget, eat healthy foods. And really, the services that we offer in the building, all of the ones I've named and a lot more, are voluntary. So you don't have to. You have a lease. You're just like any other tenant. But what kind of the secret sauce of supportive housing is that we have team, whether it be breaking ground or breaking ground partnering with an excellent social service provider. We have a team of people whose jobs it is to engage with people and help them understand that if they let us help them, they can rebuild and restore their lives.
You're doing a project in Brooklyn right now at the Jehovah's Witnesses former site, right?
Yes, yes.
And then you have a couple in the Bronx, correct?
Yeah, we have another one in Brooklyn, in Brownsville, that will top off this summer. We have one that will be opening in the summer in the Bronx. That's part of a larger complex of 5 buildings called La Centrale, where Hudson and BRP are doing some of the buildings. We're doing one of the buildings. We will be closing on a project on nature property in the summer, where we'll be building senior housing. We have another senior building that we will close on next year that will be our first permanent housing in Jamaica, Queens. So we have a lot in our pipeline, but we are on a site search all the time.
So as they would say, it was fortuitous in a way that you moved from the Bronx, from the fire hazard to the other fire hazard in Roosevelt Island, but it gave you an inkling of what you were going to do for the future. And we're very fortunate that you're the president and CEO of a great charity called Breaking Ground, and thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.